Hey everybody, Brian, we're here in Kaufman. Let's try another attempt to squelch speech in the South. So this is from the Senate on February 4th, 1836. So I believe Mexico was moving an army into Texas at the time. On a first reading, there was a bill on incendiary publications that Senator Calhoun of South Carolina had recommended. So, Mr. Calhoun, from the Select Committee to which was referred that portion of the President's message relating to the attempts to circulate through the public mails publications calculated to excite insurrection among the slaves of the slaveholding states, made a report thereon accompanied by a bill. The report, which is a very long one, having been read, the bill was read the first time and ordered to a second reading. So here is the synopsis that they had of the bill. Section 1 provides that it shall not be lawful for any deputy postmaster knowingly to receive and put into mail any pamphlet, newspaper, handbill, or other printed, written, or pictorial representation touching on the subject of slavery, directed to any person or post office where by the laws thereof their circulation is prohibited, nor to deliver the same to any person whatsoever except such persons as may be authorized by the proper authority of such state, etc. What that means is that I live in Massachusetts. I cannot mail a pamphlet about abolitionism to my friend in Texas if Texas doesn't want me to. That is to say, American free speech can be blocked by a state government. All right, Section 2 authorizes the Postmaster General to dismiss deputies offending on the premises. Section 3 provides that it will be the duty of deputy postmasters to cooperate in preventing the circulation of pamphlets, and that nothing in former acts of Congress shall be so construed as to protect those convicted as above mentioned. Section 4 makes it the duty of the Postmaster General to furnish to the deputies the laws of the several states prohibiting. Section 5 provides the deputy shall give notice to the Postmaster General. So the first section is the substantive one. The rest of them are sort of the formal add-ons to authorize the Postmaster General and to require that he do things. So, to reiterate, Section 1 provides that it shall not be lawful for any deputy postmaster knowingly to receive and put into mail any pamphlet, newspaper, handbill, or other printed, written, or pictorial representation touching on the subject of slavery, directed to any person or office where by the laws thereof their circulation is prohibited, and the laws thereof means the state, nor to deliver the same to any person whatsoever, except such persons as may be authorized by the proper authority of the state, right? So, you cannot mail a letter to your friend south of the Mason-Dixon line, and if you did accidentally, if the postmaster did accidentally take your letter, they couldn't deliver it. All right, so later in the day, Mr. Calhoun made the following report. So, there had been a select committee to talk about this issue, and he submitted the following report. He was the chair, I think, of the committee. So he speaks for a while in his report about how it is that the Congress does not have the right to decide what is incendiary, because if it did, it would have the right to decide what was not incendiary, and in that case, it could determine what kind of mail could be sent into the states, which you'd think actually is kind of the point, right? It is an interstate relationship to mail a letter from one state to another, and that is not the kind of thing that a state is supposed to have a veto of. But he says, look, states can quarantine people, right? Why can't they quarantine the mail? Northern states, you can't import slaves into them. Well, then why should we have to import your, stupid abolitionist speech? All right, so he goes through those kind of fundamental points. So Congress does not have this right. However, the internal peace and security of the states are under the protection of the states themselves, to the entire exclusion of all authority and control on the part of Congress. It belongs to them and not to Congress to determine what is or is not calculated to disturb their peace and security. And of course, in the case under consideration, it belongs to the slaveholding states to determine what is incendiary and intended to incite to insurrection, and to adopt such defensive measures as may be necessary for their security with unlimited means of carrying them into effect, except such as may be expressly inhibited to the states by the Constitution. To establish the truth of this position, so essential to the safety of those states, it would seem sufficient to appeal to their constant exercise of this right at all times, without restriction or question, both before and since the adoption of the Constitution. But on a point of so much importance, which may involve the safety, if not the existence itself, of an entire section of the Union, it will be proper to trace it to its origin in order to place it on a more immovable foundation. And then he continues through, a very extensive kind of states' rights position, and you can see where the priority there is, right? So, hey, we don't want you sending mail down here because that might endanger slavery. So, I don't know, states' rights. On turning to the Constitution, it will be seen that while the power of defending the country against external danger is found amongst the enumerated rights, powers, the instrument is wholly silent as to the power of defending the internal peace and security of the states, and of course reserves to the states this important power as it stood before the adoption of the Constitution, with no other limitation as has been stated except such as are expressly prescribed in the instrument itself. From what has been stated, it may be inferred that the right of a state to defend itself against internal dangers is a part of the great primary and inherent right of self-defense, which by the laws of nature belongs to all communities. Right. I've got my back turned to him, reading papers to a camera. Very cowardly. So jealous were the states of this essential right without which their independence could not be preserved that it is expressly provided by the Constitution, 4th Article, 4th Section, that the general government shall not assist a state even in case of domestic violence except on the application of the authorities of the state itself, thus excluding by a necessary consequence its interference in all other cases. Having now shown that it belongs to the slaveholding states whose institutions are in danger, and not to Congress, as is supposed by the message, to determine what papers are incendiary and intended to excite insurrection among the slaves, it remains to inquire in the next place, what are the corresponding duties of the general government and the other states from within whose limits and jurisdiction their institutions are attacked, a subject intimately connected with that with which the committee are immediately charged, and which at the present juncture ought to be fully understood by all the parties. The committee will begin with the first. It may not be entirely useless to premise that rights and duties are reciprocal, the existence of a right always implying the corresponding duty. If consequently the right to protect her internal peace and security belongs to a state, the general government is bound to respect the measures adopted by her for that purpose, and to cooperate in their execution as far as its delegated powers may admit or the measure may require. Thus, in the present case, the slaveholding states, having the unquestionable right to pass all such laws as may be necessary to maintain the existing relation between master and slave in those states, their right, of course, to prohibit the circulation of any publication or any intercourse calculated to disturb or destroy that relation is incontrovertible. In the execution of the measures which may be adopted by the states for this purpose, the powers of Congress over the mail and of regulating commerce with foreign nations and between the states may require cooperation on the part of the general government, and it is bound in conformity of the principle established to respect the laws of the state in their exercise, and so to modify its acts as not only to violate those of the states, but as far as practicable to cooperate in their execution. The practice of the government has been in conformity to these views. All right, so what that means is the federal government has to respect the states saying that they're not going to allow something to be imported, at least through the federal mails. The upset continues back there. All right. The principles embraced by certain precedent laws. The principles embraced by these acts in relation to the commercial intercourse of the country are equally applicable to the intercourse by mail. There may indeed be more difficulty in cooperating with the states in the latter than in the former, but that cannot possibly affect the principle. Regarding it then as established both by reason and precedence, the committee, in conformity with it, have prepared a bill and directed their chairman to report the same to the Senate, prohibiting, under the penalty of fine and dismission from office, any deputy postmaster in any state, territory, or district from knowingly receiving and putting into the mail any letter, packet, pamphlet, paper, or pictorial representation directed to any post office or person in a state, territory, or district by the laws of which the circulation of the same is forbidden. The circulation of the same is forbidden. What the hell part of America do you live in where the circulation of a pamphlet is forbidden? That is not our country. All right, for knowingly delivering the same, so you can't, if you do accidentally pick it up, you can't deliver it. It remains next to inquire into the duty of the states from within whose limits and jurisdiction the internal peace and security of the slaveholding states are endangered. So what do the northern states have to do so that we don't have to listen to your abolitionism? In order to comprehend more fully the nature and extent of their duty, it will be necessary to make a few remarks on the relations which exist between the states of our federal union, with the rights and obligations reciprocally resulting from such relations. It has already been stated that the states which compose our federal union are sovereign and independent communities united by a constitutional compact. Among its members, the laws of nations are in full force and obligation except as altered or modified by the compact, and of course the states possess with that exception all the rights and are subject to all the duties which separate and distinct communities possess, or to which they are subject. Right, so he's saying, look, we're independent countries except where the Constitution says otherwise. Among these are comprehended the obligation which all states are under to prevent their citizens from disturbing the peace or endangering the security of other states, and in case of being disturbed or endangered, the right of the latter to demand of the former to adopt such measures as will prevent their recurrence, and if refused or neglected, to resort to such measures as its protection may require. All right, so the states' rights view here is that the southern states can demand that the northern states police the speech of their people, right? The southern states were never trying to defend states' rights. They were trying to attack states' rights. They were wild hypocrites. All right. This right remains, of course, in force among the states of the Union, with such limitations as are imposed expressly by the Constitution. Within their limits, the rights of slaveholding states are as full to demand of the states within whose limits and jurisdiction their peace is assailed to adopt the measures necessary to prevent the same, and if refused or neglected, to resort to means to protect themselves as if they were separate and independent communities. Right? So if y'all are sending your abolitionist pamphlets down here, we can protect ourselves from you. Those states, on the other hand, are not only under all the obligations independent communities would be to adopt such measures, but also under the obligation which the Constitution superadds, rendered more sacred if possible by the fact that while the Union imposes restrictions on the right of the slaveholding states to defend themselves, it affords the medium through which their peace and security are assailed. Right? So he's saying, look, it's absurd for you guys to protect free speech in the North if we don't want you to. It is not the intention of the committee to inquire what those restrictions are and what are the means which, under the Constitution, are left to the slaveholding states to protect themselves. The period is not yet come, and they trust never will, when it may be necessary to decide those questions. Those questions are whether to secede from the Union, and this is in 1836. But come it must, unless the state whose duty it is to suppress the danger shall see in time its magnitude, and the obligations which they are under to adopt speedy and effectual measures to arrest its further progress. In 1836, 25 years before the Civil War, the guy was explaining that if you Yankees keep talking abolitionism, eventually we're going to have to separate. That the full force of this obligation may be understood by all parties, the committee proposed in conclusion to touch briefly on the movements of the abolitionists with a view of showing the dangerous consequences to which it must lead if not arrested. So he's past the legalism now. Their professed object is the emancipation of slaves in the southern states, which they propose to accomplish through the agency of organized societies spread throughout the non-slaveholding states, and a powerful press directed mainly to excite in the other states hatred and abhorrence against the institutions and citizens of the slaveholding states by addresses, lectures, and pictorial representations abounding in false and exaggerated statements. The professed object of the abolitionists is to advocate the abolition of slavery. This is not particularly exciting. But notice, he says, abounding in false and exaggerated statements, we have libel and slander laws. If somebody's lying, you can go after them on that. If the magnitude of the mischief affords in any degree, so the mischief here is abolitionism. If the magnitude of the mischief affords in any degree the measure by which to judge of the criminality of a project, few have ever been devised to be compared with the present, whether the end be regarded or the means by which it is proposed to be accomplished. Right, so abolitionism is the worst crime ever. The blindness of fanaticism is proverbial. With more zeal than understanding, it constantly misconceives the nature of the object at which it aims and towards which it rushes with headlong violence, regardless of the means by which it is to be effected. Never was its character more fully exemplified than in the present instance. Setting out with the abstract principle that slavery is an evil, the fanatical zealots come at once to the conclusion that it is their duty to abolish it, regardless of all the disasters which must follow. Of course you abolish evil. Never was conclusion more false or dangerous. Admitting their assumption, there are innumerable things which, regarded in the abstract, are evils, but which it would be madness to attempt to abolish. Yeah, slavery's not evil in the abstract. It's evil in the concrete. Thus regarded, government itself is an evil, and most of its institutions intended to protect life and property, comprehending the civil as well as the criminal and military code, which are tolerated only because to abolish them would be to increase instead of diminishing the evil. The reason is equally applicable to the case under consideration, to illustrate which a few remarks on slavery as it actually exists in the southern states will be necessary. So he's sort of agreeing here that slavery is the lesser evil. And you'd think that if he thought, well, it's not that great, he would come up with some scheme for gradual abolition, but that is not what he did. Here's what he did instead. He who regards slavery in these states simply under the relation of master and slave, as important as that relation is, viewed merely as a question of property to the slaveholding section of the Union, has a very imperfect conception of the institution and the impossibility of abolishing it without disasters unexampled in the history of the world. Right? So slavery is not just a matter of property. It's much more important than that, and to abolish it would be catastrophic. To understand its nature and importance fully, it must be borne in mind that slavery, as it exists in the southern states, including under the southern all the slaveholding states, involves not only the relation of master and slave, but also the social and political relations of two races of nearly equal numbers from different quarters of the globe, and the most opposite of all others in every particular that distinguishes one race of men from another. Emancipation would destroy these relations, would divest the masters of their property, and subvert the relation, social and political, that has existed between the races from almost the first settlement of the southern states. Right? That seems very important. All right, then he talks a little bit about money. Under this relation, the two races have long lived in peace and prosperity, and if not deserved, and if not disturbed, would long continue so to live. He seriously thinks that slavery is a state of peace and prosperity. While the European race has rapidly increased in wealth and numbers, and at the same time has maintained an equality, at least morally and intellectually, with their brethren of the non-slaveholding states, the African race has multiplied with not less rapidity, accompanied by great improvement physically and intellectually in the enjoyment of a degree of comfort with which the laboring classes in few countries can compare, and confessedly greatly superior to what the free people of the same race possess in the non-slaveholding states. He is literally saying that actual capitalism is way more evil than slave labor. It may indeed be safely asserted that there is no example in history in which a savage people, such as their ancestors were which brought into the country, have ever advanced in the same period so rapidly in numbers and improvement. To destroy the existing relations would be to destroy this prosperity and to place the two races in a state of conflict, which must end in the expulsion or extirpation of one or the other. Right? So, 1836, John C. Calhoun, if you abolish slavery, we're going to have to exterminate either all the white or all the black people in the South. No other can be substituted compatible with their peace or security. The difficulty is in the diversity of the races. So strongly drawn is the line between the two in consequence of it, and so strengthened by the force of habit and education, that it is impossible for them to exist together in the same community, where their numbers are so nearly equal in the slaveholding states under any other relation than which now exists. Social and political equality between them is impossible. No power on earth can overcome the difficulty. The causes resisting lie too deep in the principles of our nature to be surmounted. But without such equality, to change the present condition of the African race, were it possible, would be but to change the form of slavery. It would make them the slaves of the community instead of the slaves of individuals, with less responsibility and interest in their welfare on the part of the community than is felt by their present masters, while it would destroy the security and independence of the European race if the Africans should be permitted to continue in their changed condition within the limits of these states. They would look to the other states for support and protection and would become virtually their allies and dependents, and would thus place in the hands of those states the most effectual instrument to destroy the influence and control the destiny of the rest of the Union. The general gist here is, hey, Americans, you do not get to speak about slavery, because if you did, we would have a race war, and it would be awful. Right? The original basic justification is white supremacy. Slavery is the form in which that was instituted at the time, and in order to protect that institution, you don't get to talk about slavery in the South. Nothing ever changes.